The blast came before the betrayal. Jack Maddox hit the ground hard, dirt and debris flaring up around him as plasma fire ripped into the building just over his head. His HUD blinked red, low shields, compromised armor integrity, heart rate spiking. He rolled behind a chunk of collapsed wall, breathing hard through gritted teeth, then tapped his comm. "Command, this is Reaper 1, we are not secure. I repeat, do not lift off." Silence. Then a click. And the sound he would never forget, the scream of a dropship thruster climbing fast into the atmosphere. They were leaving. They left him. He stared up through the fractured ceiling as the last glint of the extraction shuttle vanished into the clouds. Rage didn't come immediately. Only a low, hollow cold that coiled in his chest. A sniper round slammed into the stone beside him, snapping him back into motion. He bolted through a collapsed archway, diving into an alley littered with alien trash and bones. He didn't have time to feel anything. Not anger. Not betrayal. Not fear. Right now, he needed distance. Draven 7 wasn't a place to be stranded. It wasn't even a place to survive. Black market tech, rogue AI warlords, slavers. It was a junkyard of everything the galaxy wanted buried. And now he was part of the trash. He found an old maintenance tunnel, its keypad rusted and loose. A few quick strikes with the butt of his sidearm, and the door screeched open. The darkness swallowed him as he slipped inside. The stale air reeked of oil and rotted metal. He kept moving, ignoring the sting in his ribs. Plasma burned deep, but not fatal. Not yet. 3 levels down, the tunnel widened into a storage chamber. Abandoned. Dead power lines hung like vines from the ceiling. A busted comm station flickered weakly in one corner. He sat down, stripped off his cracked chest plate, and hissed as the burn met air. "Thanks for the extraction, assholes," he muttered to no one. "Hope the debrief goes smooth without the guy who led the op." He didn't have much left, half a mag in his sidearm, 1 utility blade, 1 cracked visor. No rations. No backup. No friends. He leaned against the wall, eyes closed, letting the sting remind him he was still alive. The echo of betrayal rolled back through his thoughts. That wasn't a miscommunication. It wasn't a timing error. Command had pulled the plug. Mid-mission. Mid-firefight. And only after he'd cleared the path. They hadn't just abandoned him. They'd used him. Something scraped against the tunnel wall. Jack opened his eyes, silent now. Focused. Another sound, metal dragging. A whisper of movement in the dark. He reached for his blade. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, alien slavers. Insected builds, narrow limbs, eyes glinting green in the gloom. One held a shock baton, the other 2 carried modified rifles. They hadn't noticed him yet. "Thermal trace said he's down here," one hissed in their native tongue. Jack's visor translated, but he didn't need it. Predators sounded the same in any language. "Bet he's fresh." "Big one too." "Good for the pits," said another. Jack moved fast. The first went down with a clean cut across the neck, no sound, just a spray of warm blood. The second turned too slow. Jack caught the rifle, twisted, and drove it back into the alien's throat. It gurgled and dropped. The third ran. Jack threw the knife. It stuck in the creature's back. The slaver spasmed and hit the floor hard. Silence. He retrieved his blade, wiped it clean on the corpse's cloak. Then he searched them. Nothing special, cracked weapons, stimulant injectors, and a locator beacon still blinking. He stared at it for a long moment. Then crushed it under his boot. "Let him come." His voice was low. Flat. Not a challenge. A promise. Jack holed up in the chamber for the night, setting traps with scrap parts and tripwire from the slaver's gear. Sleep came in broken fragments, punctuated by the occasional scuttle of vermin or distant pulse of plasma fire. Draventh never slept. The whole world pulsed like a wound. By morning, he'd found the remains of a control terminal and jury-rigged a connection. No outgoing signals. No uplinks. But the last security feed before system blackout showed the extraction ship lifting off, early, clean, coordinated. His voice never reached them. It was scrubbed before he even spoke. They planned it. He stood there for a long time, hand clenched on the edge of the terminal. That was it then. Not an op gone bad. A hit. He wasn't supposed to come back. He looked at his reflection in the broken screen, blood-smeared face, eyes sunken with exhaustion, but still sharp. They didn't know him. They trained him to adapt. To disappear. To kill with silence and vanish like smoke. And they thought they could throw that away like a failed asset. He turned, grabbed his gear, and made for the surface. They wanted him gone. Dead and forgotten. Fine. He'd become something worse. A shadow without orders. A ghost without a leash. And when they looked back, if they survived long enough to look back, they'd remember this day not as the day they abandoned a soldier, but as the day they created a predator. The first time they saw him, they didn't realize it was him. The bounty hunters were too focused on the corpse dangling from the ceiling, strung up with fiber wire like some primitive trophy. What used to be a Graxian smuggler had been sliced open down the middle, intestines splayed like a warning banner, a human combat knife buried in his throat. 3 of them stood under it, armor gleaming, visors down, scanning the shadows. No blast marks, one muttered, checking his scanner. No energy residue. This wasn't plasma. Blades, another answered. Hand to hand? The leader, a tall, scaled merc in matte black composite gear, raised his head and sniffed. Close. He's watching. He was right. From a perch above them, hidden in broken ceiling struts and insulated with thermoplastic strips to mask his heat signature, Jack Maddox waited. Calm. Controlled. He tracked their movements with his eyes, memorizing angles, grip positions, gear weight. They were fast, but not precise. Armed, but overconfident. Paid killers, not soldiers. He dropped. The first never saw him coming. A snap neck ended him before his body hit the ground. The second spun too slow. Jack caught the rifle barrel, yanked it upward, and slammed an elbow into the merc's throat. A twist, a crack. Down. The third screamed and fired blind. Jack rolled low, closing the distance. One hand struck the merc's leg, the other drove a stolen plasma knife through the chest plate seam. The scream turned into a gurgle. 3 seconds. 3 bodies. Jack exhaled. His heart rate barely moved. The room was quiet again. He dragged the corpses into the dark, took what he could use, shock grenades, ammo, a wrist module with a council encryption override. He left the rest. The body overhead remained, swaying gently like a metronome. A message. The slums began to whisper. They called him the Ghost. A thing out of myth, silent, faceless, brutal. An assassin from a forgotten war. Some said he was a prototype from a Terran black lab. Others thought he was a rogue AI gone feral. None knew the truth. That he was just a man they left behind. And he was just getting started. He moved through Draventh like a disease. Unseen, unheard, but always leaving devastation behind. He took down gang captains in their bunkers, sabotaged armories, set fire to slave transport ships. His pattern was impossible to track. He never hit the same faction twice in a row, never used the same method. Sometimes it was blades. Other times, traps or repurposed council tech. The locals began marking their doors with sigils, primitive warding signs. Hoping the Ghost would pass them by. He wasn't interested in civilians. Just the predators. Jack watched, listened, studied. He learned the layout of the city's underbelly, memorized routes, identified choke points. He mapped every syndicate movement, tapped into abandoned surveillance grids, piggybacked signals off the comms of the men he killed. He was building something. A system. A plan. But even ghosts draw attention eventually. Word filtered up the chain. In the polished towers of the Galactic Council Nexus, far from the grime and blood of Draventh, High Strategist Velkarn Diaro reviewed the report with a bored expression. Dozens of pages, surveillance stills, conflicting witness accounts, biometric scans, tactical analysis. It all pointed to one conclusion: a lone human operator was crippling half the illegal trade networks on the Outer Rim. "This is what you bring me?" Velkarn asked, tapping one clawed finger on the table. "One Terran, and you think I should care?" "Sir," the aide replied, shifting nervously. "He's not just some merc. He's trained. SEAL, by old Earth standards. We believe he was abandoned during Operation Halberd. Council sanctioned." Velkarn's gaze sharpened slightly. "You're saying this is our mess?" "Yes, strategist." Velkarn leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Deploy a hunting party. Quietly. Use the Helix units. No survivors. If they fail..." He smiled. "We'll erase the story." Back on Draventh, Jack was already expecting them. He'd seen the change: more sophisticated hunters, tighter formation patterns, better equipment. Someone high up was paying attention. Good. That meant the game had changed. He didn't run. He escalated. He found an old smuggler dock on the edge of the canyon cliffs, long abandoned and half collapsed. Perfect. He rigged the supports with stolen thermite charges, positioned traps at every entrance. Motion-triggered pulse bombs. Sound decoys. EMP mines disguised as heat leaks. Then he waited. They came at dusk, 6 Helix-class bounty elites. Augmented muscle, neural-synced armor, zero hesitation. The first step into the compound triggered a flash mine. The second opened a trapdoor. One fell 20 meters onto a bed of broken rebar. 2 more entered from the sides. Jack let them. He struck with precision, shooting out the light, dropping from above, firing 2 shots before diving into shadow. Confusion spread. One merc fired wildly and set off the EMP mine. Their comms and HUDs went dark. Jack moved through them like a reaper in fog. When it ended, only one crawled away, his helmet cracked, leg torn, eyes wide with something deeper than fear. Jack let him go on purpose. That night, across the black channels of the rim, a new symbol appeared, a human skull etched into a council data pad, dripping blood onto the council's emblem. And beneath it 6 words. "I'm not lost. I'm hunting you." They thought they left a man to die. They didn't. They left behind a mission. The wind tore through the canyon like a predator of its own, dragging dust and static across the jagged cliffs. Jack knelt in the shadow of a derelict signal tower, one hand pressed against the cracked console, the other holding a piece of council-grade equipment he'd ripped from a corpse 2 nights ago. The override codes were still intact. So was the soldier's blood. He spliced the transmitter into a scavenged panel, and rerouted the uplink through 3 layers of encryption. His fingers moved with practiced precision. This wasn't just sabotage anymore. It was infiltration. "Come on," he muttered, watching the connection thread across old networks like a virus. "Show me where you sleep." The screen blinked. Files unzipped. Topographical layouts, patrol routes, supply lines. Most importantly, a schedule. In 2 standard days, a weapons convoy would pass through the Lurian Divide, a narrow ravine loaded with blind spots. It was council-supplied. High-tier gear. Restricted access. Quiet delivery. They assumed no one would know. Jack smiled to himself. He didn't care about the weapons. Not really. But if he could hijack that convoy and leave their own tech bleeding across the rocks, it would speak louder than any threat. A direct message. He spent the next day preparing. He bartered with locals who didn't ask questions, traded scrap intel for components. In a tech-drenched back alley behind a smelter, a one-eyed merchant gave him a modified cloak field in exchange for an old plasma stabilizer and a bottle of Terran whiskey. Jack didn't drink anymore. Not since Halberd. Not since he realized every drop dulled the edge he needed to survive. Night fell fast on Draventh. Always did. The light never stayed where it belonged. Jack moved through the darkness like he belonged to it. By morning, he'd rigged the divide with a symphony of traps. Remote-triggered shock fields, anti-grav destabilizers, and a section of the rock face primed with shaped charges. He used council codes to spoof an emergency beacon, just enough to bring the convoy in lower than usual. Predictable. Just like their arrogance. He positioned himself in a broken spire above the pass. Camouflage active. Pulse rifle primed. Breathing steady. The convoy arrived on schedule. 4 grav trucks, 2 escort cruisers, and a lead scout drone skimming the canyon ahead. Too fast. He adjusted, recalculated. Then he moved. The first detonation dropped the lead cruiser before it even cleared the curve. It spun mid-air and slammed into the canyon wall, ripping a trail of debris behind it. The second was timed perfectly. Shock field activated just as the third truck entered the radius. Systems fried. Engines died. Jack dropped from the cliff face, landing hard on the first transport roof. Plasma rounds sprayed upward, missing. He slid down the side, tore open a maintenance hatch, and hurled a charge inside. The boom kicked dust and smoke across the ravine. He didn't wait. He leapt, rolled, sprinted across the side of the collapsed cruiser, and lit up the final escort with precision bursts to the propulsion array. It spun out of control and careened into the cliffside in a plume of fire. Chaos. Radio chatter broke down within minutes. Half the convoy had no idea what was hitting them. Jack moved from shadow to wreckage, fast and deliberate, finishing off anyone still holding a weapon. One of them tried to beg. Jack stepped past him and dropped a knife between the ribs. No speeches. No hesitation. The last surviving soldier stumbled out of the command cab, hands raised, blood trickling down one temple. "Please," he said. "I'm just transport. I don't even know who you are." Jack didn't reply. Instead, he tossed the man a small comm device. The soldier looked at it, confused. "Play that," Jack said. "To your commanders. On repeat." The soldier blinked. "What?" Jack stepped close, low voice like gravel on steel. "They left me to die. I adapted. Tell them I'm still adapting." He turned away as the man collapsed against a rock, shaking. The device blinked green as it transmitted. Jack vanished into the cliffs before the second wave could even scan the wreckage. The message spread like wildfire. Within hours, it reached the fringes of council space. Within days, rumors flared across back channels. A convoy hit, annihilated. Not by a faction. Not by rebels. One man. No survivors. No demands. Just a voice and a shadow that kept moving. In the marble-white chambers of the council nexus, High Strategist Velkarn Diaro stared at the hollow footage in silence. The wreckage was real. The symbols carved into the vehicles, real. The voice in the recording? Human. Gritted. Cold. One of their own failures, weaponized against them. "Why wasn't this contained?" Velkarn asked, his voice level but tight beneath the surface. "We tried, strategist," said his adjutant. 3 strike teams gone. The Helix squad did not return. Velkarn turned slowly. "So we sent elite operatives. And this thing dismantled them like amateurs?" The adjutant hesitated. "He's not a thing, sir. He's human." "Seal designation. Jack Maddox." Velkarn's lips pulled back in distaste. "No human should be this effective." He tapped a claw against the data pad. "Send in the prototypes." The adjutant's eyes widened. "The prime class since?" Velkarn nodded. "Yes. And prepare a containment vault. I want him alive." He leaned forward, eyes cold. "I want to know how he thinks." Somewhere far from the pristine council halls, Jack sat in the dark, sharpening a blade pulled from one of the wrecks. The fire crackled low beside him. He wasn't just fighting anymore. He was studying them. Learning. Watching how they responded, how they adapted, or didn't. Because this wasn't revenge. It was reconnaissance for something bigger. Something still taking shape behind his eyes. They thought he was dangerous now. They hadn't seen anything yet. The canyon was silent, too silent. Jack lay prone across the upper ridge, body pressed into the coarse rock, eyes behind a low-vision scope. A storm brewed on the horizon, dark clouds rolling like ink over the jagged skyline. Lightning crackled in the distance, painting everything in pulses of pale blue. He'd set the trap with precision. The broken freighter below had been dragged into the ravine piece by piece, reconstructed just enough to look like a wounded smuggler's ship. Faint power signatures leaked from its reactor. The distress beacon pulsed every 2 minutes, automated, subtle, designed to suggest desperation. He'd also left the bodies. Old kills. Staged like a recent massacre. Council insignia on the armor, blaster burns clean and deliberate. Enough to look like an ambush. Enough to bait what he wanted. Movement caught his scope. 6 signatures descending the far cliffside. No ships. No noise. Just sleek humanoid figures with gleaming exosuits, moving in perfect formation. Prime-class synths. Jack shifted slightly. These weren't bounty hunters. These were engineered weapons, designed for zero-mistake operations, battlefield cleaners, each one packing enough muscle to crush stone and software smart enough to adapt mid-fight. The Council was finally serious. He waited until the lead synth crouched near the freighter's entry point. They scanned the scene, one placing 2 fingers against a fallen helmet. A red light blinked inside its visor, scanning for DNA traces. That was his cue. Jack tapped the detonator once. The explosive charge buried under the freighter's belly blew upward in a wave of fire and shrapnel. Metal folded like paper, smoke rushing outward. The synth was thrown skyward, limbs flailing as its system sparked. The others scattered, fast, disciplined. Jack was already moving. Down the ridge, boots scraping against loose gravel. He landed on the first level of the cliff path, ducked low, and unhooked the EMP charge from his belt. One flick, one press. He hurled it over the edge, letting it drop into the ravine like a falling star. The blast pulsed. A shockwave of blue light rolled outward. 3 of the synths shorted momentarily, just long enough. Jack hit the ground running, a plasma carbine hot in his grip. He fired short bursts, one into a synth's leg, dropping it to a knee, another straight into a power node on the second's spine. Sparks exploded. He didn't stop. The third one recovered faster than he expected. It charged, silver frame glinting, arms sweeping low to grab him. He rolled, narrowly avoiding the strike, and came up swinging with a serrated combat blade. The edge dug in just above the collar. Not enough to kill, but enough to stagger. The synth's fist clipped his shoulder. Pain lanced through his arm. He stumbled, regained his footing, pivoted around and drove the blade back into the same spot, this time deeper, forcing it through to the core relay. The synth collapsed in a heap of twitching limbs. 2 left. One dropped from above, landing behind him. Jack spun, raised his rifle, but it knocked the weapon clean from his hands. A blur of movement, he barely ducked a sweeping kick, then planted a knee into the thing's midsection and grabbed a rock, slamming it twice into the exposed sensor cluster. The last synth hit him from behind. He hit the dirt, air blasted from his lungs. Fingers clawed at his belt, yanked the last smoke charge free, cracked it, and shoved it upward into the machine's face. Mist hissed out, clouding the air with stinging gray gas. He rolled away, grabbed his sidearm, and shot 3 times into the smoke. Silence. Then a thud. He coughed hard, spitting blood. His vision swam. His shoulder screamed every time he moved. But he was alive. He stood over the broken bodies, looking down at the sleek, glimmering failure the Council had sent to kill him. No human should have survived that. No one expected him to outthink adaptive machines. He left one still functioning, barely. Its limbs twitched, trying to move. He crouched beside it, pulling off his mask just enough for it to scan his face. "I want your masters to see," he said. "I want them to know I didn't run. I built this grave for you." He dropped a flare beside the crippled machine. Bright red. A signal. He didn't vanish this time. He stood tall in the ravine as the storm finally broke, lightning striking somewhere in the cliffs. Rain hit hot against scorched ground. Back at the Nexus, Velkarn Diaro stared at the live feed from the synth's fading optics. Static pulsed across the screen, but the image was clear enough, a single human, standing in the wreckage, watching the camera without fear. You should have sent more, Jack said into the lens. Velkarn crushed the tablet in his claws. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Jack walked through the Nexus like he belonged there. Clean armor. Council issued, stolen off a commander he'd get it in an outpost 3 days prior. Mask sealed, ID tags spoofed, retinal signature cloned. It all checked out. They never expected infiltration from below. Not here. Not at the seat of galactic power. Their arrogance was a door he simply walked through. He passed highborn diplomats, security drones, and protocol officers without a glance. Most of them didn't even register his presence. To them, he was just another enforcer. Another cog in the machine. Perfect. His path took him through the core levels, vaulted halls of white marble and reinforced crystal, polished floors reflecting artificial sunlight. Everything was pristine, designed to project control. It reeked of power. And blindness. He stopped at a maintenance panel beside a service elevator. No one looked twice. A quick patch from his wrist module, and he was inside the auxiliary systems. Power lines. Ventilation paths. Security feed access. He wasn't here for sabotage. Not this time. He was here for Velkarn. Top floor. Strategic operations. The man behind the betrayal. The architect of Halberd. The one who ordered Jack's name buried under redacted files and classified silence. He hadn't just left Jack to die, he tried to erase him. Jack took the elevator up, slow and quiet. The pistol at his side was loaded with ghost rounds, silent, low flash, impossible to trace. The blade strapped to his back had been sharpened on hull plating and cleaned with synth oil. Every step was earned. The doors hissed open into a private corridor. No guards. Of course not. Velkarn never thought he needed protection. Jack walked until he reached a curved archway with gilded framing. 2 tall doors loomed ahead, embossed with the council crest. He didn't knock. Just walked through. Velkarn was standing by the window wall, back turned, hands clasped behind him. A panoramic view of the galaxy unfolded before him. Worlds, stars, fleets in formation. It was a commander's fantasy. You came, Velkarn said. Jack didn't speak. I expected something more dramatic. Explosions. Fire. Velkarn turned. His eyes were calm. You've already cost me 2 sectors worth of order. Why not just burn the whole building? Jack stepped closer, slow and measured. I'm not here for a message, he said. I'm here for you. Velkarn nodded. Of course you are. He didn't move. No panic. No reach for a weapon. Only a quiet study of the man in front of him. You were good, he said. Too good. That was the problem. The Council doesn't like variables it can't control. Then you should have killed me properly. I thought I did. Jack drew his blade. Velkarn didn't flinch. I watched the footage, Velkarn said, voice low. I saw what you did to the synths. The traps. The precision. You turned every asset we gave you into a weapon against us. Jack stopped 2 meters away. You taught me well. No, Maddox. You taught yourself. A pause. You could have been so much more. We could have used you. Jack's eyes narrowed behind his visor. That's the last mistake you'll make, assuming I was ever yours to use. He raised the blade. But Velkarn lifted a hand. I didn't bring guards, he said. No traps. No escape hatches. If you want this to end here, it ends. Jack didn't lower the weapon. You want to die? Velkarn tilted his head. I want the galaxy to know why. He tapped a control on his desk. The walls shimmered. Hidden recorders lit green. Broadcasting live. You'll make me a martyr. No, Jack said coldly. I'll make you an example. He stepped in. One clean strike. Deep and fast. Velkarn staggered, choking, staring at the blood spreading across his robes. He collapsed into his chair, gasping, eyes wide but not afraid. Not anymore. Reaper, Velkarn rasped, voice fading. You could have been a god. Jack leaned close, whispering near his ear. I'm already a ghost. He pulled the data shard from Velkarn's console and slid it into his gauntlet. Every classified file. Every cover-up. Every betrayal the Council buried. He left Velkarn slumped in the chair, blood soaking the marble. The alarm didn't sound. He walked out the way he came. By the time they found the body, the data had already spread, beamed across BlackNet nodes, resistance cells, civilian news clusters. Halberd. The betrayal. The experiments. The death squads. All of it undeniable. The Council tried to spin it. But the galaxy had seen too much. The man they tried to kill became the myth they couldn't bury. No one saw Jack again. Some say he vanished into the outer void. Others claim he walks among the wreckage of ruined Council worlds, watching. But all of them know one thing. They created him. And they would never be safe from him again.